Hi, I'm Steve Pleich, and I'll be your host for this evening's program on Voices from the Village entitled The NSA, Domestic Spying, Who Watches the Watchers? The National Security Agency's domestic spying program is officially referred to in government documents as the President's Surveillance Program, or simply the program. It was implemented by President George W. Bush shortly after the attacks of 9/11. The United States government still considers the program officially classified, but a tremendous amount of information has recently been exposed by various whistleblowers, admitted to by government officials during congressional hearings, and has been exhaustively reported by major newspapers across the country. During this evening's discussion, we will touch upon all those sources of information. But several questions remain unanswered. Is the NSA's ongoing data mining part of something much larger and more insidious? Are we as a society adjusting to life as a surveillance state? Are we willing to relinquish bits of our privacy in exchange for the promise of other rewards? And perhaps the most Orwellian question of all, who watches the watchers? Although we all have vague feelings of uneasiness about this current state of domestic surveillance, it rarely translates into serious thinking about where we set the limits. Joining me tonight are three local activists who are doing that serious thinking and asking those hard questions. I'm very pleased to welcome Dennis Etler. Dennis, welcome. Mithrell Bowerman, welcome. And Colin Campbell Clyde. Colin, welcome to you. As we always do, we went out on the street this week and asked the people of Santa Cruz whether or not they thought that the government was spying on them. Here's what they had to say.
This is Voices from the Village. We're in downtown Santa Cruz and we're asking people, how much do you think you're being spied on by the government?
I feel they're invading everyone's privacy. They're stepping on their toes and they're overpressing their bounds. They shouldn't be doing any of that.
Definitely a lot. I mean, I think the government's just in everyone's business right now, and so you just need to know that.
I think the focus is probably directed in the wrong way. I mean, there's a lot of people that are doing things that should be watched and aren't, and they're watching people that there's no reason to be, watched, I guess.
I think it's stupid. I think it's ridiculous. I think we should be able to lead our own lives and not have anyone spying on us.
I don't really have a positive answer, I guess. I don't feel comfortable about it, if that's what's really going on. I'm sure it always has been going on, but it's going to continue to go on. So what are we going to do about it?
They give us the illusion of privacy, and there's a lot of it's not really. It's hard for me to say in the words because I want to say so much, but I think that we are losing our privacy very slowly, especially with social media and stuff like that.
I'm ex-military, and it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. People don't understand what they have. The inside of your phone, you have actually a camera on the other side, and they can see you, whatever you're doing. My security clearance, I was able to see anything at all. Like I asked my mom where's she at. I was like, give me your code on the back, the IDMI code, and I was able to type it in and actually see everything she was doing. She was at the supermarket buying eggs and milk. And no, it's we have no privacy anymore. Nothing.
Violation of privacy.
It is a violation of privacy, but anyone can look at it, whether it's the government or whether it's the guy down the street. He can read my emails if he wants to. So how do we monitor that? What government are we going to put in place that's going to be able to regulate that and say, okay, well, we're not going to watch, and we're going to make sure some other guy isn't going to watch? If you're putting yourself out there and you're making yourself not private, it is what it is. If you're going to let yourself be out there, then you have to be out there. And if you have something to hide,
don't put it out
there. Don't put it out there. The government shouldn't be able to see it. If you don't want them to see it, don't put it out there.
That's what people had to say today in Santa Cruz. Back to you in the studio.
Well, not surprisingly, the people of Santa Cruz are giving this a lot of thought, and they seem to be relatively knowledgeable about the extent to which they're really being spied upon or their privacy is being invaded. One of the beauties of Voices from the Village, by the way, is this is a live call-in show. So as we go through our conversations tonight, if you want to call in, 425-8844, 425-8844, ask any one of the panelists a question, they'd be happy to answer that. Dennis, let's get started with you. You've been a panelist before. You were here on Human Rights Here and Now. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became engaged in this NSA spying issue.
Okay, well, I am an instructor in anthropology at Cabrillo College, and but obviously that doesn't have any direct bearing on the question of the NSA and spying. But I do have a history that goes back to when I was growing up in the 1950s during the McCarthy era. And my family has been involved in what might be called leftist politics, going back generations.
Well, you're in the right place.
Right. So I'm very familiar with surveillance because my father was actually blacklisted in the 1950s. And one sort of apocryphal story, there would be a knock on the door, every Christmas tide, and there would be a couple of guys in a fedora and a trench coat at the door, and we'd pass over a bottle of whiskey, and they'd be off. They were FBI checking up on us, checking up on my father. So I mean, this has been going on for generations, and basically it's a means to rein in political dissent. Now, of course, we have the technological sophistication to surveil everybody, not just those who are targeted. So that's sort of my motivation. It's based on a history of,
and
observing this sort of thing.
It's interesting that the technological advances that we take advantage of and really enjoy so much are the very things that are really now closing off our ability to get on there and do that and use it. So it's ironic in that respect. Mithrell, welcome back. You were here for Human Rights Here Now, a segment that I was fortunate enough to host for David Sweet on the Occupy. So welcome back. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you become engaged in what is a fairly activist issue here in Santa Cruz now.
Well, actually, it was that I was in Occupy, and it's been revealed recently that Occupy activists were spied on very extensively.
Say it ain't so.
and in particular, that people who organized anti-NDAA protests were spied on even more than the rest of the Occupy activists. It was National Defense Authorization Act, and that is actually something that goes through periodically to fund the military. But these were amendments that were tacked on. That would greatly increase the penalties for example, protesting near the president or any sort of designated national security event. And so in March of 2012, we organized a protest against the encroachment upon our freedom to protest, our freedom of speech. And one thing that was revealed is that Occupy activists who engaged in those activities were spied on even more than regular Occupy activists. So I kind of got dragged into it and felt that I was in it already. But even if that were not the case, I have always been a strong defender of civil liberties, and this is exactly the type of thing that concerns me, that the encroachment upon our freedoms protected by the Bill of Rights, and particularly the First and Fourth Amendments in this case.
And as you know, I'm the vice chair of our local ACLU, and I often bemoan the fact that we are not more engaged in the protection of civil liberties at that level, and perhaps we'll be able to learn something as the conversation goes forward and find a way that we can really be more effective. Colin, you've been a long time local activist, and certainly in the forefront, I think, of a lot of the whistleblower and the Julian Assange and Chelsea and Manning and Edward Snowden. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you came to this this kind of occupation and the engagement with it.
Well, I've been involved in one form of activism or another for years. When 9/11 happened and Iraq was invaded, I was out there marching in the streets against the illegal occupation of Iraq and also Afghanistan. And my interest in what was going on with WikiLeaks and the person who is formerly known as Bradley Manning, who has changed her name to Chelsea Manning because she is a transsexual. As sort of an outgrowth, my interest was an outgrowth of that anti-war activism, because Bradley Manning's leaks were specifically related to the U.S. war effort in Iraq and Afghanistan. The most prominent and well-known, of course, being the collateral murder video, where Iraqis are shot from a helicopter while you hear the radio communications of the helicopter pilot, and they're just gleeful about, like, look at those dead people down there. They just having a great time killing people. Two of those people were Reuters reporters, so it's kind of a situation where there's insurgents who are firing at the helicopter, therefore they take that to mean we can just kill anybody in the area.
And I think as a reporter of the news yourself, certainly the viewers may know that you had a live stream show of your own and some things like that.
YouTube channel, the Magic Box Radio
So,
channel.
you've been engaged in this for some time, kind of as a reporter and as kind of a journalist in that way. Well, one of the questions I asked at the beginning of the show was is this NSA, is the ongoing data mining, is this part of something much larger and more insidious, and I think that we can all agree that the revelations recently have indicated that it may very well be. But Dennis, what's your take on that?
Okay, well, the rationale for all of this is the war on terrorism. But when I look at that, I wonder, really, why is there this war? What's the underlying cause for, terrorism and it being directed against ourselves? So I think we have to go somewhat deeper and see that, basically terrorism is blowback from our actions overseas, by trying to extend our influence into various regions of the world, imposing our economic and political system on countries that are not at our stage of development and going off in whatever type of developmental program they want, but we want to basically control that situation. And people resist that, and it gets expressed in terrorism. So the basic root cause of all of this is our attempt to impose hegemony on the world. And therefore, you have to see the surveillance that's being done in that context. So basically, the surveillance is in support, as I see it, of the corporate state and its attempt to impose its will both domestically and
Colin, you have something to add to that?
The surveillance is, that has generated all this controversy after the Edward Snowden leak, is one part of sort of a bigger, overarching bureaucratic policing security structure. And so when we look at this, we have to view the NSA reading everybody's emails and cell phone data and that sort of thing in the context of we live in a country that has a higher percentage of people in prison than any other country in the world. We live in a country where your local police department is being militarized and run like an army with SWAT teams and kicking people's doors in and this sort of thing.
So, Mithrell, I'll ask you, is this part of something much larger and more insidious? Do you see as the depth and breadth, actually, of this kind of surveillance by the government on private citizens?
Yes, actually, touching on Dennis's point, that has been done all over the world for many decades, but now it's coming home. Now we're at a point after the collapse of 2008 that there's unrest here in the United States, that I think that the U.S. corporations are perhaps not terribly secure in their position. If we look at who was spied on, who's been reported to be spied on, it's the Occupy movement, which is not some shady, foreign terrorist organization, but people who are critical of the role of large financial institutions, the role of large corporations, and the role of the government in collusion with them. And I think that there is a great danger here as we see all these grassroots movements springing up, anti-fracking, anti-GMO, and things of that nature, that there may be attempts to corral them, to suppress them and keep them from coming to full fruition. And as I said, this has been done to the rest of the world for many decades, and now it's coming here to the United States.
And I think that there is a counter-argument to be made on balance, and that is that most people would believe, they might not agree, that there are individuals and groups in this country who are a danger to our national security. And so in order to keep tabs on those people and to prevent domestic attacks, that a certain level of surveillance is acceptable. And so they're willing to give away some of their privacy. And Ben Franklin's famous quote is, if those who are willing to sacrifice liberty for safety deserve neither. So that kind of a thing is true in terms of people being willing to say, well, I don't want another 9/11. I don't want Al-Qaeda attacks domestically, so I'll allow myself to be surveilled to a certain extent. And that's the counter-argument, of course.
Yeah, well, if I could have a comment on that. You got to look at the level of terrorist activity in this country, which is really minimal.
Yeah.
You have the
But that may be the reason for
well,
that.
you can say, yeah, you can actually say that perhaps, what's that?
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, you can say perhaps, well, maybe the NSA has prevented that. But when you look at the scale of...
oh, certainly.
Yeah, it's obvious that immense resources are being applied to address an issue that's really of a much smaller scale than it would be warranted by, this immense outlay of money. So I think it's a disproportionate application of resources. Given the relatively low degree of threat that exists.
You're saying? Well,
yes.
Mithrell, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that we're also discussing the NSA surveilling everyone, every single person in the United States. That's what these revelations have revealed. There's perhaps a separate conversation about whether certain people would be targeted and surveilled, but that's not really what we're talking about right now. What we're talking about is this great blanket surveillance against every single person.
So you're more likely to die from slipping and falling in the bathtub than you are in the United States from being killed by a terrorist. There's been all this fear-mongering in the media about terrorism, and the government has sort of taken the word terrorism and really given it this elastic definition that's used for these other crackdowns. David Miranda, who is the lover of Glenn Greenwald, who is the journalist who wrote the Edward Snowden NSA stories, was detained in England in the airport for 9 hours and questioned under what's called Schedule 7 of the UK Terrorism
Which was
Act.
the maximum amount of time he could be held.
Yes, yeah.
Go on.
So they're using this legislation that was put in place to fight terrorism to do a crackdown to try and intimidate people who are engaged in journalism. So somehow journalism got conflated with terrorism there.
Yeah. Let's take a question from the audience.
There's a lot of surveillance in this country, is what I'm hearing. How about in other countries? Is it just as bad in other countries of the world? And is it everywhere? And should we start getting ready to go to Mars? Or, where are we going to go? What are we going to do if it's everywhere?
Well, that's a fair question. And part of what we're talking about, and what Keith Alexander, who is the chairman of the National Security Institute, will say that, well, the Posse Comitatus Act doesn't allow us to surveil domestically. But nevertheless, they can surveil, all over the world. So, is it a fair question? Is there this level of surveillance, in other countries outside of the United States?
Well, I think we're facilitating that. In many countries where we have influence, we basically supply the technology, as in Egypt and elsewhere, for those governments to surveil domestically dissident elements. So, if anything, we're enablers of that, worldwide.
Yeah, I think and domestically that kind of to frame the discussion a little bit is that in my introduction I was talking about the President's surveillance program, which was a result of the attacks of 9/11, and then of course there's been this surveillance for this long period of time. And then all of a sudden, Edward Snowden appears, and everybody's shocked at the revelations that, my gosh, the NSA is not just this low-level surveillance intelligence gathering organization. They're getting information on everybody. And then the president comes in and says, well, we know that there is some surveillance that maybe we shouldn't be overstepping ourselves, but, And so then people begin to realize through the congressional hearings, through the news stories, through the Glenn Greenwalds, people like that there is a pervasive plan to surveil and gather information on just about everybody.
And also, right after the president came out and said that, the Washington Post published some more revelations that indicated that the NSA had violated its own policies thousands of times. So, as there had been an attempt to have reassurance that this is all very controlled and that there's strict oversight, within the same week, the Washington Post is publishing articles that actually that's not true.
So to address the question about spying in other countries, one of the big controversies with the Edward Snowden leak is the spying that the NSA is doing of people's cell phone and internet activities in countries like Germany is incredibly controversial. there because they went through the experience with the Stasi, the secret police, during East Germany, and so they know full well what a surveillance state is and what it's capable of, and how that is threatening to liberty. And also, you know, he was in Hong Kong, and the U.S. had requested his extradition, and he went and leaked, well, the U.S. is actually involved in not only surveilling China, but actively, you know, doing malicious hacking attacks into Chinese computer systems.
Well, it raises an interesting question that I actually alluded to in the introduction, is that overseas surveillance, people have had historically such a low expectation of privacy. You know, it's common to say, well, everybody, they're watching me, they're watching me. Are we here in the United States, are we beginning to adjust to the imposition of a surveillance state? You know, where our expectation of privacy is going to be lowered and lowered because of the threat of something, you know, more, you know, difficult and challenging times?
That's not really my impression based on people's reaction. There has been a lot of outrage in the United States and a lot of pushback, and I think some, you know, polls from June, there are 3 different ones, find different results, but, you know, 59% think there's too much in one, 53% think there's too much in one, and then a third poll was flipped, it was 56%. This probably illustrates things change based on how you ask the question. But if you look at people who are really engaging, who are commenting on articles and calling into radio shows and things of that nature, it's just overwhelmingly against as far as these revelations go. I think that there's a lot of hope here in the United States. We really have a long tradition with the Bill of Rights. And additionally, for example, The Guardian, after their computers were smashed in the basement of The Guardian with 2 government officials standing by as part of this compromise. That happened on July 20th. They've said, well, in the United States, they have the First Amendment to protect journalists, so we can operate somewhat more out of the United States. So we actually are in kind of a special position here to not accept a coming surveillance state.
Yeah, and notwithstanding the statements from the administration, which haven't exactly been reassuring. I mean, even the administration doesn't seem to know exactly what the left hand and the right hand is doing, and say, well, but we're going to, you know, keep an eye on it. We're going to, you know, Congress is going to be imposing, you know, stricter laws and sanctions and restrictions. But when they set up this, they have the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, as the FISA court is the one that issues the warrants to do the kind of surveillance that is invasions of people's reasonable expectation of privacy. And they justify it on that. If you watch Keith Alexander again, he will say, oh, we don't do any of this domestically unless we have a warrant. You know, we're not looking at your emails unless we have a warrant. You know, where do they get the warrant? They get it from FISA, you know.
And I'd like to point something out here. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
That's what they call it.
We are going to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court to determine how much spying is going to go on domestically. Because this was never supposed to happen.
Right.
When that was set up, this was not intended to be used against U.S. citizens. This was supposed to be used against, you know, scary foreign terrorists. So I think there's something interesting about the name of that court.
So it begs the question, how did it happen? Is it our conversion to a corporate estate? As you say, the corporations are so nervous about their particular standing and their ability to maintain power that they would yield, you know, some of the, you know, privacy aspects to that, as long as they're keeping people down and keeping them in power. Dennis, you see any correlation
I think
to that?
one thing that we haven't touched upon is that what might be called the surveillance industrial complex, so like the military industrial complex. Not only, you know, those who manufacture the surveillance equipment, but all of these consultancy, you know, operations that Snowden, you know, basically worked for. He was not working directly under the auspices of the NSA. He was working for
Booz Allen Hamilton.
Right. You know, which was you know, contracted to perform those surveillance activities. So there is that aspect of special interest, you know, wanting to perpetuate this sort of surveillance national security state.
Well, so I think that the corporate influence and the outsourcing and privatization of the military is definitely a key piece here. Also, major thing that happened is the sort of opportunist way that the Bush administration and the government took advantage of the state of panic that existed in the public after September 11, and that this ideological framework known as the War on Terror set the stage to kind of blur those lines between before 9/11, and this was one of the reasons that Thomas Drake, who was an NSA employee turned whistleblower, leaked the information that he did, was because it had been a tried and true rule in the NSA before that you do not spy on American citizens. The NSA was set up after
Although prohibited
World
to
War
do that by the
II.
Posse Comitatus
Yes,
Act.
yes, exactly. The NSA was basically essentially set up to fight the Cold War, and so it was dealing with the signals intelligence from foreign countries. Those lines got blurred because all of a sudden you could say that we're going after foreign people who happen to be residing in the U.S. and are in these terrorism cells and all these kind of nightmare stories.
And there really
that
hasn't been very
about.
much documentation that these cells actually exist. I mean, they might be, at a minimal level, but
I mean, the majority of terrorism in the United States has been done by right-wing people and fundamentalist Christians.
But putting that question aside for the moment, what bothers people, the average citizen, I think, is the fact that their privacy is being invaded. I think they would be willing to accept the fact that certain information has to be gathered. Let's put aside the terrorist threats and things like that, so long as that information is only used for that purpose. People ask me, they say, well, how did Chelsea Manning get into a position where she was able to divulge all this information? Did she have this immense amount of training and she was so embedded in the military and industrial framework? Well, no. She had some systems management training and she was a PFC. How did Edward Snowden, how was he able to get to that level to divulge that much information? That's what scares people. It's not necessarily so much that it's being compiled, it is not being secured. And so everything that you have on your telephone, your cell phone, your email, your internet, if that's being used for the purpose of combating terrorism, then that's one thing. If it's just being put out there because it's an invasion of privacy, that's another.
Yeah, so actually what you're talking about is positing national security against personal security. I mean, there's a contradiction there, and that has to be brought out.
Well, it's state security versus civil liberties. So, you were mentioning that, and I think it's a very important point to make.
So this question of limits and this question of what can the government actually do? The Constitution, and specifically the Fourth Amendment, prescribes those limits in very unambiguous language. You hear these Obama speeches where he's always saying, well, we have these concerns about privacy, but we have to weigh them against these concerns about national security, and really civil liberties don't work that way. Civil liberties are an on-off state. You either have them or you don't. So the moment you start talking about sort of compromising them away a little bit, that's when you don't have civil liberties anymore. The Fourth Amendment says that you can be secure in your persons, houses, papers, and effects, and that in order for any sort of search to go on by police agencies, they have to get a warrant first.
And there was, before we go to this, we have a short clip that I like to show, and it shows it's what they call a security alert or something like that. We'll take a look at it. It talks about Verizon and their ability to gather information. So if we could see that, that would be interesting, I think.
Truth Alert for June 5, 2013. The National Security Agency is, and has been collecting the phone records of millions of Americans daily. A top-secret court order requiring Verizon to hand over all call data shows scale of domestic surveillance under Obama. The National Security Agency is currently collecting the telephone records of millions of U.S. customers of Verizon, one of America's largest telecoms providers, under a top-secret court order issued in April. The order, a copy of which has been obtained by the United Kingdom news outlet The Guardian, requires Verizon on an ongoing, daily basis to give the NSA information on all telephone calls in its systems, both within the U.S. and between the U.S. and other countries. The document shows for the first time that under the Obama administration the communication records of millions of U.S. citizens are being collected indiscriminately and in bulk, regardless of whether they are suspected of any wrongdoing. the Secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISA, granted the order to the FBI on April 25, giving the government unlimited authority to obtain the data for a specified 3-month period ending on July 19. For more information on this story, click the link in the video description.
So that's fascinating. Anybody who has a contract with Verizon can expect to have their calls cell and regularly monitored. And they did mention this, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the FISA court that's issuing these warrants. Very important. When you're talking about reasonable expectations of privacy, they give way to warrant searches. If a magistrate feels that there is some reasonable, grounds for a warrant, then, that your civil liberties, as a lawyer, I can tell you, are going to give way to that, presuming there's a showing being made. In this case, I'm not really certain that there's any showing being made to invade the privacy and the reasonable expectation of privacy that people are maintaining, based on what we're seeing in a worldview or domestically.
Yeah, I think there are two issues here. This information can be abused in a number of ways. It could be just sort of a rogue, agent who is, taking advantage of access to personal information to use for whatever purpose they want. But then again, it could be something that's more centralized. Right. A government surveillance of dissidents, in society. And what we're doing is we're extending the definition of terrorism to include, the Occupy movement or, environmental, protesters.
We got a call. Excuse me, Dennis. We got a call from Karen. Karen, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, please ask your question.
Oh, I was wondering about the organization InfraGard. Have you ever heard about that?
No, that's a new one for us, I think. Our panelists are shaking their heads. Can you tell us a little about it?
Sounds familiar, but
yeah, I've heard the name, but I couldn't.
Totally.
Well, I guess we... Oh, yes, Karen, you still there?
Yeah.
Well, tell us just a bit about that, so maybe we can discuss it.
I have to turn this up. We're on speakerphone out here.
Okay.
He wants to know what it's about. Well, it's a governmental agency that's also a public agency, and it was set up by the FBI to help monitor the public and public waterways and public facilities, like, I don't know, all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And they're boasting that they have about 7,000 people a month signing up to be members, and there's a chapter in San Francisco and another one in Los Angeles, and then a third in Sacramento, as in just in California, but it's nationwide. And from what I hear, they're allowed to carry a firearm, and they don't get prosecuted if they kill somebody.
Wow. Well, it sounds a bit, thank you, Karen, appreciate that information. It sounds a bit like some of our militias that arm themselves and carry out what they believe to be, this righteous investigations of national security. But that's really, I think a different kind of a topic, although it's related in some ways. One thing I wanted to mention and bring this down locally, as you know, we have this predictive policing program that we started here and has moved to other places. Now somehow they are gathering information so they can predict where crimes are going to be committed. That's just another example, I think, of people being acceptant of a surveillance state, of an invasion of privacy, thinking that it's going to protect them down the line, not from terrorists, but simply from criminals. And certainly you've heard of that, and you have any observations about that, Dennis, about the predictive policing locally?
Oh yeah, I think this mentality, this overemphasis on national security, locally becomes, this focus on public safety and the surveillance of those, dispossessed, people in the community who are seen as a threat to public safety. Generally, what I refer to as the homeless or the like. And I think it's a pervasive mentality that's being propagated. So this national surveillance state, this concern with national security gets translated locally into this, overemphasis on public safety when there really isn't that great an issue?
Again, you're talking about the difference between, well, does the depth and breadth of this surveillance by the National Security Agency, is it justified by the level of terrorism and the threat that's domestically? Well, probably not, And is the invasion of privacy that occurs when you're gathering information to predict the occurrence of a crime here in Santa Cruz, if it impacts you, is that commensurate with the level of crime here in Santa Cruz? So that's kind of the question. Had you heard of that, the predictive policing? Have any observations about that?
Yeah, this is not local, but it occurred to me that the stop and frisk law in New York City was just overturned.
Yeah.
And that, of course, affected almost exclusively blacks and Latinos. And this is a policy where anybody could be stopped at any time if they were walking down the street and they looked suspicious.
Right.
And thankfully, that has now been overturned by a court. It's probably going to continue on. But I think that is an example of we're thankfully not at that level yet here in Santa Cruz, but that's an example of what can happen if this mentality goes too far.
And I think that's right. We're not at that level, but certainly we're trending to that. And that's what's been happening with the National Security Agency and the President's surveillance program, that we've been trending to where we are now. And if the trend continues, it's a very slippery slope down to where they're going to know everything about you. And it doesn't have to be justified for anything except to say national security and we've got it handled.
I think there's been a tipping point, though, actually, with the National Security Agency itself. I think that 10 years ago, people were shrugging this off. They were saying, we need to catch the terrorists, we'll give up some civil liberties.
No, sure.
Now, supporting the Constitution is the new patriotism. You're seeing right-wing conservatives that are enraged by this. You're seeing people of all political stripes that are objecting to this. There's really, often we have these conversations and we lament that there isn't public support for the things that we're concerned about. But in this case, there very much is. And we're at this wonderful opportunity right now, and I think if this passes, we may not get it again, but we actually can rein in the NSA. And a lot of efforts are going on. There's the defund the NSA movement. There's the Amash Amendment, which very narrowly lost in the House of Representatives, 205 to 217. And these are the type of numbers that indicate it's not a landslide. This is very close. This is going to come back again, and we still can rein this in. We don't just have to accept
it. And I admire anyone's ability to listen to congressional hearings. That an hour is tedious, but they expand to 5 and 6 hours. It becomes soul annihilating. So you just cannot, listen to what they're saying. But you would like to think that they would like to put some legislation in place that is going to at least set parameters on this. I'm not certain that just because you're talking about regulation. I'm not certain you're talking about laws that are going to prevent certain things from happening. Frankly, those laws are already in place. But you're going to have to establish clear parameters of exactly what the NSA can do, what FISA can do in terms of issuing warrants, things like that. So and that's the kind of activism that we need. And that's the kind of thing that the three of you, and I congratulate you for, when actually we were all talking about it, but you actually organized and went out into the street and started talking to people about it. Let's see, what can we do? Here's what's going on. What can we do? A call to action. And as you say, if there is an opportunity here, then it's an opportunity not to be missed. And I think that's really the salient point.
Well, and using that particular rally, which is pretty much the reason that we were invited to be on this show, as a kind of
you're all my personal
informal.
Favorites,
well, that's pat myself on the back here. Using that rally as a kind of informal survey of where the public opinion is on this NSA issue. People driving by in their cars on Ocean Street. I mean, we just had an overwhelming response of people honking their horns and saying right on and supporting what we were doing. So I think there is a lot of public outrage over this. Edward Snowden has a higher approval rating than Barack Obama now. Take that, Obama supporters, okay? And people are more concerned about civil liberties than they are about terrorism in a recent poll, which is a flip-flop of what the political climate has been for the last 10 years or so, going back to September 11. The Amash Amendment was sponsored by Justin Amash, who is a Republican state representative. And so this is an issue that cuts across ideological lines, people who might disagree with each other on issues such as gay rights or abortion or something like that can agree with each other that they don't want to be spied on.
There's another very interesting point to be made. Prior to the revelations by Snowden, there was all this media attention on cyber espionage, supposedly of China against U.S. Government and corporate entities and whatnot. And since the Snowden revelations that the U.S. was engaging in that sort of hacking and espionage against China and other countries, that has just fallen right off the map. You don't hear anything about cyber espionage, and Chinese hacking in the mass media any longer, which just goes to show that people are seeing through the smokescreen and the hypocrisy of our position.
And I do think it's important that when you give people an opportunity to speak out locally, on this grassroots level, the problem, which seems so large and so massive, actually comes to something that they can react to and figure out and maybe do something about. That's what's important about being able to have discussions like this, having rallies, demonstrations, and making sure that the issue is still being brought to light, but at the same time trying to make some progress in protecting our civil liberties. And again, I'll be the first one to say that our local ACLU has not done as much as we could, and perhaps this being a touchstone of that, the civil liberties being so important in this respect, that maybe it will galvanize us into some action. But the template of being able to get out and being a grassroots in what you're doing really exemplifies kind of what you have all been doing. So one of the questions that I did have in the intro was, who watches the watchers? I was going to do it in Latin from law school, but I thought that would be a little obtuse, so I didn't want to do that. But really, is there any opportunity in what we see now in the congressional hearings and just the general momentum across the country of some civilian oversight on this? So you take it out of the purview of the chain of command, or take it away from governmental agencies to do this, to let average citizens, presuming they have the expertise to do so, be a watcher, to watch the watchers. Dennis, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think the sort of actions that we engage in and are taking place all across the nation at a grassroots level, that is the pressure, that's being applied, and that's really essential. I mean, if people aren't out there engaging themselves in this issue, then the representatives in Congress aren't going to do a damn thing about it. So I think it really has to be it has to begin at the grassroots level. Public opinion is essential for oversight to occur.
And I think also one thing that happened during the Amash Amendment campaign is through social media, the word spread about the campaign, and there was a call your representative right now.
Right.
Say this
Ironic
issue is
that
very
that is the case,
say this is very important, and I think that's one of the reasons it's got so far. This very much is not over. That vote was so close, and so that is something that's ongoing. And a couple useful websites to go to would be defundthensa.com. There's also stopwatching.us, and you can contact us here locally at stopthensa@usa.com.
Colin, what's your views and recommendations on the possibility of some kind of civilian oversight, who watches the watchers kind of a thing?
Well, I think that basically, like Dennis said, that the more people get actively involved in this issue, the better our chances of getting some kind of improvement on this front are. So this is kind of an appeal to the people at home watching this on television is get involved, call your local representative, check out some of the websites that Mithrell
Come to our next rally.
Come to our next rally. Email us at stopthensa@usa.com if you're interested in helping us organize. But tell people, just having conversations with, say, the people at work, and let's say you work for a locally owned small business. Do you want the government spying on your small business? Engage people in conversation about that. Not everybody is like a big news hound who's kept up with what's going on with Edward Snowden or with WikiLeaks. So share that information.
And that is really something that we haven't touched upon as much as I might have liked to, is the part that the whistleblowers have played and are playing in this current wave of awareness in terms of the NSA and their surveillance of ordinary individuals. And Dennis, what's your observations about the roles that really the Snowdens and the Assangers and the Chelsea Mannings have played or are playing?
Both Manning and Snowden obviously have gotten the bulk of the publicity, but there are many others who are virtually anonymous because they're just not known, who have also been engaged in whistleblowing. They've been sort of swept under the carpet, so to speak. So I think it's important that they, what they've done also be publicized to a much greater extent, so that we see that this is a pattern that is, basically being implemented. It's not just these, one-off instances. It's a whole pattern of suppression of information and persecution of those who do blow the whistle.
Right. Mithrell, your observations about the part the whistleblowers are playing in this awareness?
I think actually it's remarkable the power of one person. Edward Snowden has changed the country and perhaps
he certainly changed the conversation.
But I think it's bigger than that. I'm cautiously optimistic that this isn't just going to die out in some committees and some reports that go nowhere. I think we really have a genuine opportunity to get somewhere with this.
Colin, your observations about the part the whistleblowers have played in this
I think whistleblowers
issue?
have been absolutely crucial, and they are very much the lifeblood of anybody who's doing any sort of real investigative journalism. A big problem that we're having with not only the NSA, but sort of the overall attitude of the federal government is this tendency towards secrecy and running a secret government. And whistleblowers are the antidote to that. Whistleblowers bring truth to light and inform the public, look, this is what your tax money is being spent on. The Obama administration has used the Espionage Act, which is an arcane piece of legislation that goes back to World War I, more than all other presidents combined twice over and then some, to go after whistleblowers and try to criminalize them and shut them down. And I think that what's going on here is bigger than just the NSA spying on people, which in and of itself is very important. This is a war over information and who gets to control information, who gets to share information, what kind of information people get to are allowed to share with each other, and that you see that in the crackdown on whistleblowers and this, which is essentially amounts to a criminalization of journalism.
And as I was saying earlier, it is ironic to me that the great technological leap forward that allows us to travel the informational highway, now this kind of invasion of privacy is making us reluctant to do that very thing. And so I said, geez, I'd like to go on and find out something about a controversial issue of any kind, because you're naturally curious about something. Is that going to be transmitted somewhere to some dark back room, and all of a sudden it gets plugged into a program that has a keyword that all of a sudden I'm suspect if we're doing some kind of the thing that is violating national security in some way. That's the large irony to me, and the thing that really occurs to me, I think.
Another point that should be made is this is a systemic problem. It's not specific to the Obama administration or the Bush administration, Democrat or Republican. It's an ongoing phenomenon, and it builds upon itself, and that has to be acknowledged as well.
And I think Mithrell was mentioning something earlier about we've all been involved in the Occupy movement and involved in trying to reform, at least, or revolutionize a growingly corporatist society. I'm wondering how much that plays into what is happening with the NSA and the information gathering.
Well, I think one important point here is that it's not just the government. They're working closely with these private contractors that work for corporations. So even if we rein in the NSA, and the NSA stops spying on us, the danger is that spying will still occur. It'll just be done by these private contractors. So it's going to be necessary, as we have this movement to rein in the NSA, to not only look at the NSA, but also to look at those private contractors and make sure they are not violating people's privacy.
And there's even a deeper concern. A lot of the commercial enterprises, Google and the like, are collecting immense amounts of information so that every one of us can be profiled. And those profiles then can be basically obtained by the government.
It's interesting you mentioned that. Had we time, we were going to do a little graphic that Keith Gudger, who is the chair of Community TV, great guy, showed me, is that there's a program that did at MIT, and they're able to track all of your Gmails, not to read your Gmail, but who your to and froms. And they can see this web of people that you're sending all these to and froms, and they can build, a dossier of the kind of information.
Well, that's what the NSA is doing. I mean, that's the whole, the whole
It was fascinating. I wish we would have had time to be able to show that in a graphic.
There is the commercial aspect of it, Facebook or the like, where they're obtaining immense amounts of information, and that information, in and of itself, can be obtained by the government for whatever purpose they want. With a warrant of whatever sort.
And that's a point that I so often make. I made it in relation to needle exchange. When needle exchange went from the volunteer organization that was completely anonymous in their contacts with intravenous drug users to a health services agency whose information is confidential but not anonymous. The danger of that information that's been gathered being disseminated in some other way, as I mentioned earlier, is so great as to render any safeguards really for that, just unrealistic, and that bothers me considerably.
So I think we're at a state within the development of the internet as a communications technology where it's really still in its infancy. I mean, it's analogous to 20 years after Gutenberg invented the printing press. The publishing industry back then was not as sophisticated as it is now. And so the fact that, like you were saying, that there's so many benefits that we get from this technology. You can find a person in a crowd with a cell phone. You could never do that before.
Answer a question that's been in the back of your mind all day long.
Right, exactly. Well, Google knows.
Combine this with predictive policing, and then you get a minority report sort of scenario.
All of those benefits, and then we're seeing these drawbacks of this also opens the door for more extensive and massive surveillance program from the government than anything that's ever existed before. I think the fact that Edward Snowden and the whole saga of what went on with him has generated and fomented this public conversation is really vital, because I think it's absolutely crucial to really the future of human civilization, whether or not we have an open and free internet and are able to use those technological tools to our advantage. And the conversation that we're having about surveillance now is part of a broader conversation of what are the parameters of a functioning and beneficial internet.
And I think it's important to not only fight to this battle for this, as I say, too broad and too deep surveillance of the domestic folks here, but also to support the whistleblowers themselves. We're talking about the whistleblowers, but so long as Edward Snowden is someone who is a figurehead for this, who is symbolic of this, he is a symbol, he remains a symbol. Chelsea Manning has remained for the 3 years of her incarceration, and now, you wonder why Edward Snowden didn't turn himself in when President Obama says, well, we just want to have him here to the rule of law. Well, when he saw the rule of law came down for 35 years on Chelsea Manning and dishonorable discharge, I think any ambivalence on his part pretty much went away.
And she was tortured before she even went to trial.
Yeah, so it's important, I think, for all of us to really honor and remember those folks, because they're lighting the way. We all have to find our own way, I think, but more light is shed on things by people who bring them to the national attention and keep them focused there. And perhaps if not for Edward Snowden, if President Obama said, I think the NSA is being a little too invasive, but we're going to take care of it, I don't know that there would be, the kind of the public hue and cry that there is and should continue to be now. Yeah. And we've got about a minute left. Just a few seconds from everybody in conclusion. Dennis?
Well, I think we just got to continue doing what we've begun to do, and hopefully we can generate more public support. Just have to keep at it.
Mithrell?
Well, I think we're fighting the battle of whether we're going to have a futuristic Orwellian surveillance state or a free country. And actually, it is up to us, not some other people, but us, to decide what direction that's going to go.
Colin, a couple of words?
You know, people always say when they find out that I organize rallies and do activism, oh, thank you so much. That's so great that you're doing that. And I always have really mixed feelings about that because ultimately, like, back at you, like, you get involved. You come to the next, you email us at stopthensa@usa.com.
Well, thanks, Dennis, Mithrell, Colin, for being here.
Can we blow our
Thanks,
whistle?
wait a minute. Now, thanks to everybody behind the scenes, the engineers. Thanks to Charlie Phillips, our engineer. I'm Steve Pleich, thanking you for watching this segment of Voices from the Village, and support your whistleblowers. Mine doesn't work. Thanks very much, everybody.
Community Television thanks Hoffman's Biscuit